In 1970, four working-class kids from Birmingham walked into a studio and accidentally invented an entire genre of music. Black Sabbath didn't just create heavy metal. They defined it, shaped it, and gave birth to a sound that would influence every rock band for the next 50 years. Tony Iommi's guitar riffs were darker than anything anyone had heard before. Ozzy Osbourne's haunting vocals turned songs about war and despair into anthems. Geezer Butler's bass lines shook the foundations of every venue they played, and Bill Ward's drumming drove it all forward with an intensity that made audiences forget how to breathe. But success came with a price that none of them were prepared to pay. By the mid-70s, cocaine and alcohol had infiltrated the band so completely that they couldn't function without it. Recording sessions turned into disasters. Tours became survival exercises. And the four friends who changed music forever were tearing each other apart. One substance-fueled argument at a time. This is the story of how Black Sabbath rose from nothing, created everything, and nearly destroyed themselves in the process. If you're loving this story already, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into music history. Now, let's dive in. Birmingham, England in the 1960s wasn't exactly a paradise. The city was still recovering from World War II, with bombed-out buildings scattered across neighborhoods and factory smoke choking the air. Kids growing up there had two options: work in the factories like their parents, or find a way out. For four teenagers named Tony Iommi, Ozzy Osbourne, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, music became that way out. Tony Iommi was working in a sheet metal factory when disaster struck. On his last day before quitting to pursue music full-time, a machine accident severed the tips of two fingers on his right hand. For most guitarists, that would have been the end. But Iommi refused to quit. He fashioned homemade thimbles from plastic bottle caps, detuned his guitar to reduce string tension, and taught himself to play all over again. That accident, as brutal as it was, led to the thick, heavy sound that would define Black Sabbath. Lower tunings meant darker tones, and darker tones meant a completely new kind of music. Ozzy Osbourne, meanwhile, was bouncing between dead-end jobs and minor legal trouble. He'd been in and out of prison for petty theft, and his prospects looked bleak. But he had a voice that could cut through any room, raw and emotional in ways that traditional rock singers weren't. When he answered an ad that Iommi had placed looking for a vocalist, something clicked immediately. They didn't sound like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. They sounded heavier, stranger, more dangerous. Geezer Butler brought the intellectual edge to the group. He was the lyricist, the thinker, the one who read books about the occult and world events and turned those ideas into songs. His bass playing was aggressive and melodic at the same time, filling the space between Iommi's guitar and Ward's drums with a rumbling foundation that made everything feel massive. And Bill Ward was the engine. His drumming wasn't just about keeping time. It was about building tension, creating momentum, and driving songs forward with a relentless energy that made audiences feel like they were part of something bigger than themselves. Together, they formed a band called Earth. But after discovering another band with the same name, they needed something new. Geezer had watched a horror film called Black Sabbath, and the name stuck. It was dark, ominous, and perfectly captured the vibe of the music they were creating. They started playing clubs around Birmingham, and people didn't know what to make of them. This wasn't feel-good rock and roll. This was music about war, death, and the darker sides of human nature, and people couldn't get enough of it. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. Let's keep going. Black Sabbath's self-titled debut album dropped on Friday the 13th, February 1970. The timing was either brilliant or cursed, depending on who you ask. The opening track started with the sound of rain and church bells, followed by a guitar riff so heavy it felt like the ground was shaking. That riff, the one Tony Iommi played on a beat-up guitar with homemade finger thimbles, changed music forever. It was based on a tritone, an interval that medieval musicians called the devil's interval, because it sounded so unsettling. And it worked. Critics hated it. They called it simplistic, loud, and offensive. But audiences loved it. The album sold like crazy, climbing the charts in both the UK and the United States without any radio play or major promotional push. People were drawn to the darkness, the honesty, and the raw power of the music. Black Sabbath wasn't trying to make you feel good. They were trying to make you feel something real. The band followed up with Paranoid later that same year, and that album solidified their place in music history. The title track became an anthem. Iron Man turned into one of the most recognizable riffs in rock history. War Pigs became a protest song that spoke to a generation tired of violence and political corruption, and the album went platinum. Black Sabbath had done what most bands only dream of. They'd created a sound so unique that it spawned an entire genre. Tony Iommi's guitar work on Paranoid showcased everything that made Black Sabbath different. His riffs were simple but devastating, built on power chords and dark melodies that stuck in your head for days. He wasn't trying to show off with flashy solos. He was building atmospheres, creating moods, and making the guitar sound like a weapon. Ozzy's vocals complemented it perfectly. He wasn't technically the best singer, but his voice had character, emotion, and an authenticity that studio-polished vocalists couldn't replicate. When Ozzy sang about war, you believed he'd seen it. When he sang about paranoia, you felt it. Geezer Butler's lyrics took the music to another level. He wasn't writing about girls and parties. He was writing about nuclear war, environmental destruction, and the existential dread of living in a world that felt like it was falling apart. And Bill Ward's drumming provided the backbone for all of it, shifting between slow, doomy passages and explosive, rapid-fire fills that kept the energy unpredictable. By 1971, Black Sabbath had released 3 albums in less than 2 years, and all of them were massive successes. They were headlining arenas, selling out shows, and influencing every rock band that came after them. Bands like Metallica, Iron Maiden, and Judas Priest would later cite Black Sabbath as their primary influence. Without Black Sabbath, heavy metal as we know it wouldn't exist. But success brought problems that none of them were prepared to handle. Suddenly, they had money, fame, and access to anything they wanted. And what they wanted, increasingly, was drugs. Cocaine became a constant presence in the studio and on tour. Alcohol flowed freely at every stop, and the pressure to keep producing hits, keep touring, and keep living up to the legend they'd created started to take its toll. Recording sessions that should have taken weeks stretched into months. The band would show up late, argue about arrangements, and struggle to focus long enough to finish tracks. Tony Iommi later admitted that during the recording of some albums, they were so intoxicated that they couldn't remember what they'd played the day before. They'd listen back to recordings and have no idea how they'd created certain parts. It was chaos. But somehow, they kept producing music. Ozzy was hit the hardest by the lifestyle. He'd always had a self-destructive streak, even before the band made it big. But fame amplified everything. He drank more, used more, and started isolating himself from the rest of the band. There were nights on tour where he'd disappear for hours and no one knew where he was. Other nights, he'd show up to performances so intoxicated that he could barely stand. The audience didn't always notice because Ozzy had a way of channeling that chaos into his stage presence. But behind the scenes, it was becoming unsustainable. Geezer Butler wasn't immune either. He dealt with the pressure by withdrawing, using substances to numb the stress of constant touring and recording. Bill Ward struggled with alcohol in ways that affected his drumming, his health, and his relationships with the other band members. And Tony Iommi, as the de facto leader, was trying to hold everything together while dealing with his own demons. The band that had revolutionized music was falling apart from the inside. Their albums from this period reflect the turmoil. Sabbath. Bloody Sabbath, released in 1973, was a masterpiece, but it was also a sign of the cracks forming. The music was darker, more introspective, and tinged with a sense of desperation. Songs like Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Killing Yourself to Live weren't just titles. They were confessions. The band was aware of what they were doing to themselves, but they didn't know how to stop. Tours became increasingly dysfunctional. There were missed flights, canceled shows, and incidents that would have destroyed lesser bands. The chemistry that made Black Sabbath special was still there musically, but personally, they were drifting apart. Arguments became more frequent. Trust eroded. And the substances that were supposed to make everything easier were making everything worse. By the mid-70s, Black Sabbath was still one of the biggest bands in the world, but they were running on fumes. Every album felt like it might be their last. Every tour felt like it could end in disaster, and the friendships that had started in Birmingham were being tested in ways that seemed impossible to overcome. The end came in 1979. Though it had been building for years, Ozzy's behavior had become too erratic, his substance use too overwhelming, and his ability to function as the frontman of Black Sabbath too compromised. The rest of the band made the decision to fire him, a choice that felt both inevitable and heartbreaking. Ozzy had been the voice of Black Sabbath, the face of the band, and losing him felt like losing part of their identity. But Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward weren't ready to give up. They brought in Ronnie James Dio, a powerhouse vocalist with a completely different style than Ozzy. Dio's voice was operatic, precise, and technically brilliant. He could hit notes Ozzy never could, and he brought a professionalism to the band that had been missing for years. The album they recorded, together, Heaven and Hell, was a massive success. It proved that Black Sabbath could survive without Ozzy, and it introduced a new generation of fans to the band, but it also marked a shift. Black Sabbath with Dio was a different band, with a different sound and a different energy. The raw, chaotic spirit of the Ozzy years was gone, replaced by something more polished and controlled. It was still heavy metal, but it wasn't the same Black Sabbath that had invented the genre a decade earlier. Ozzy, meanwhile, launched a solo career that would eventually eclipse Black Sabbath in terms of commercial success. His first solo album, Blizzard of Oz, produced hits like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley, and established him as a solo artist who could thrive without the band. But even Ozzy's solo success came with a cost. His substance abuse continued, leading to incidents that became legendary for all the wrong reasons. The story of him biting the head off a bat on stage became part of rock folklore, but it was also a sign of how out of control things had gotten. Back in Black Sabbath, the revolving door of vocalists began. After Dio left, the band cycled through singers, trying to recapture the magic of their early years. Ian Gillan from Deep Purple joined for one album. Tony Martin recorded several albums with the band, and eventually, Ozzy returned for reunion tours that drew massive crowds, but couldn't fully heal the wounds of the past. The addiction issues that had plagued the band never fully went away. Bill Ward, in particular, struggled with alcohol for decades, dealing with health problems that stemmed directly from years of heavy drinking. He's spoken openly about how close he came to dying, and how the lifestyle of a rock star nearly destroyed him completely. Geezer Butler and Tony Iommi also dealt with their own battles, though they managed to find more stability over time. Despite everything, Black Sabbath's influence on music is undeniable. Every heavy metal band that came after them owes a debt to the sound they created. Metallica, Slayer, Pantera, and countless others have cited Black Sabbath as their primary inspiration. The dark, heavy riffs that Tony Iommi pioneered became the blueprint for an entire genre. The lyrics that Geezer Butler wrote about war, corruption, and existential dread became the thematic foundation for metal music. And Ozzy's voice, as unconventional as it was, became iconic. In 2017, Black Sabbath played their final show in Birmingham, the city where it all started. Ozzy, Tony, and Geezer took the stage together one last time, performing the songs that had defined their lives and changed music forever. Bill Ward wasn't there due to ongoing disputes and health issues, but his presence was felt in every drumbeat that echoed through the arena. The show was emotional, cathartic, and a reminder of just how far they'd come. The band members have been candid in interviews about the toll that addiction took on their lives and their music. They don't romanticize it or pretend it was all part of the rock and roll lifestyle. They acknowledge the damage it caused, the opportunities it destroyed, and the pain it inflicted on themselves and the people around them, but they also recognize that they survived it and that their music outlasted the chaos. Black Sabbath's story is a reminder that talent and success don't make you immune to addiction. These were four incredibly gifted musicians who created something revolutionary, but they were also human beings dealing with pressures and demons that nearly destroyed them. The fact that their music endures, that new generations continue to discover Black Sabbath and find meaning in their songs, is a testament to the power of what they created. Tony Iommi once said that Black Sabbath's sound came from darkness, but it was also about finding light in that darkness. The band's music acknowledged pain, fear, and struggle, but it also offered catharsis and connection. For millions of fans around the world, Black Sabbath's songs became anthems of survival, resilience, and defiance. And that legacy is what remains long after the addiction and chaos have faded into history. Black Sabbath invented heavy metal, shaped an entire generation of music, and paid a steep price for their success. The addiction that infiltrated the band nearly destroyed them, but it didn't erase what they accomplished. Their music continues to inspire, influence, and resonate with fans across the world. From the Birmingham streets to arenas packed with thousands, Black Sabbath proved that darkness could create something beautiful, even when it threatened to consume them. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into music history. Drop a comment below and let me know which band or musician you want me to cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.